Welcome to our session on techniques for modernizing Android apps. Today we're going to talk about Android engineers at Reddit and how they have approached a variety of modernization and tech debt efforts. We want to share what has worked for us, what hasn't, and what we've learned along the way. By the end of this session, we hope you come away with some new ways to assess, adopt, and evangelize new technologies for your projects and your teams, ideally with more success and fewer regrets. Speaking of regrets, we don't think you'll regret coming to this talk. We've tried to distill our learnings in such a way as to be valuable to every developer, no matter where they are in their journey. Aspiring developers are starting new projects, and they often fall in love with their ideas, and they think of these choices as permanent. They fail to account for the fact that success is going to force them to adapt as their business grows. By the way, this is the only time in the lifetime of an app where no tech debt exists, yet. Similarly, early stage developers might be supporting successful applications, but they're already starting to feel the weight of their decisions. They need to make choices quickly and accrue tech debt strategically to grow at a pace that they need to. They don't have time to slow down, and they're accruing debt at the fastest pace. Finally, established developers and organizations have committed to supporting their users and apps for the long term. These engineering teams assume they're going to change their minds, and they're looking for ways to reduce the pain and cost of doing so. Reddit as a whole fits into the established developer category. They've been around a while. But I'd classify our mobile efforts as still rapid growth phase. Anyway, we believe you will find value, or at least validation, in this talk, no matter where you and your organization are at. And you can let us know after if that holds true. Now let me introduce the engineers who will be sharing stories from Reddit today. I'm Lori. I lead the Android platform team at Reddit. The first time I spoke at DroidCon in 2009, there was no such thing as a legacy Android code base. Back then, I was encouraging you to write your first lines of code in your first apps using Cupcake or something. Times have certainly changed. Many of you manage code bases and engineering teams of size and complexity that we could not have dreamed of back then. Reddit has certainly experienced this growth. In the past few years, we've grown from a small team of mobile engineers to over 100 and have a fairly complex code base that you're going to hear quite a bit about today. With me are three of our amazing Android platform engineers, Savannah, Steven, and Catherine, and each has a unique story to tell about projects at Reddit. So let's get started. Do you ever dream of burning down your app and starting from scratch? Maybe it even seems safer than trying to do what pretty much amounts to rebuilding a plane in flight. Are you having trouble convincing your company to address some serious tech debt and it's really starting to drag you down? Well, that's what happened to us. Our build times got high. Our architecture became inconsistent and outdated. We lost that small, intimate team feel as teams grew and split and grew again. Onboarding and feeling productive day-to-day became a real challenge for everybody. Most companies that experience rapid growth struggle to balance feature and tech debt work, and we were no exception. Scaling is hard. What works for you when you're small doesn't always work for you when you become a bigger company. Platform teams have evolved to help the business negotiate these challenges and weave in opportunities for teams to be more effective. With the pace of innovation on mobile, from new languages to new APIs and SDK updates, there's always something on the horizon to help you get a new competitive advantage. What's interesting about platform teams is we often know what we need to do. Like, we know we need to get ready for Android 14. But we still have to rally and convince a bunch of people to get the ball rolling. Often, we think this value is obvious to everybody. This is a mistake. It's obvious to us. Selling modernization efforts to fellow engineers is usually pretty straightforward. We like working in new tech. We usually assume it's better than old tech. We know what it's like to slog through legacy systems. And we've been burnt in the past by updates we weren't prepared for. However, we might need to use different tactics or approaches to sell the exact same work to our product leadership or our executive team or someone else who needs to sign off. One thing I've learned is that when you take your engineering projects and you put them into product language, using the same units of measurement, you enable the business to start comparing apples to apples, and you can prioritize more effectively. Instead of an existential debate between feature A and tech debt B, you put both in business value terms and let the best idea win. For example, there is a big difference between saying, we want to rewrite our apps from Java to Kotlin because it's a superior programming language, versus we want to rewrite our apps from Java to Kotlin to eliminate key types of crashes that many users experience, to reduce instability in our apps and our experiments, to hotfix less often, to improve our code maintenance and make debugging easier for developers. And we think this work might save each developer an hour of toil and unplanned work a day. Once your project gets approved, that's when the real work begins. Our platform team asks a few key questions about a project when we get started. This helps us head off any of the challenges we're likely to encounter and prepare. It is important for us to do this, especially for succeeding on the largest projects. Personally, I like flight checklists. I feel like they allow us to take the aspirational to a level of specificity that we can act upon. I also like thinking of large projects as adventures that we're going to go on together, ones that we need to prep for, but not overplan. Inevitably, there will be side quests. That is fine. The good news is that by this point, you should be done with most of the boss fights, and we can focus on the journey. So, checklists can be boring, like this slide, or they can be reframed in ways where everyone can be encouraged to focus on the adventures we will have together. What does success look like becomes, when can we celebrate? Or even better, when can we have cake? When is the value delivered becomes, when will we start to feel the benefits of doing this work? This one is super important to have with your impatient stakeholders up front. Some projects, you can get incremental wins along the way and you start feeling it as soon as you start the project. Some, you'd only really get the payload at the end. Make sure everyone understands how it's going to feel while you're doing this work. Let's see. Savannah is going to talk about this a bit when she talks about our incremental wins in our modularization efforts. Is now the right time, and are we ready? People have a limited amount of patience for how long a project can be on your roadmap, and for how much time and space it takes up. So make sure you're ready, and don't start until you are. This is especially important with resourcing. If you launch a project and it has no resources, the clock is already ticking and people are wondering when it's going to be done. Next, for any project of significance, we know we will have to make the case over and over again to stakeholders and new partners, and even to ourselves to remind us, why did we start this project in the first place? It's important to figure out who you need to bring along on the ride. Who are your key partners? Are they okay with the risks and the rewards? Are we all sharing a definition of what we're doing? Equally important is who will be upset if they are not involved. It really sucks to be brought in late to a project that you feel like you should have been brought in early to. Steven is going to touch on a lot of this when he talks about our compose and design system adoption. Similarly, who needs to actually do this work? Who's coming on this adventure with us? And must we all go together for reasons? Or can we just send Steven? How will we track and incentivize progress? I'm going to lean into the adventure metaphor here a bit. Do we have a map and a compass? And are we going to know when we're on track or off track? Do we have the appropriate incentives to make the project go faster or slower, depending on what we need? Catherine will be speaking to this when she talks about how we track projects and maintain healthy momentum. Finally, at what point should we reassess? This one is really important. Discuss in advance when you should turn back. You should plan in times where you pause, validate, and revisit your assumptions. It will make the conversations you have to have later easier if you've agreed in advance when you should look at the state of affairs. It is much harder to do this when you're in the thick of it, so agree up front. Keep in mind that it isn't failure so much as a project exit criteria when the costs outweigh the benefits. You don't want to continue those projects. Know when to fold. All right, hold on, what's going on here? One last important note here. Sometimes the what and the why are not compelling to your team right now, even when there's a lot of hype. It is okay when that happens. You cannot take on all priorities at once. So maybe now is not the time for you, and wait and see is a valid strategy. Shelve those ideas, but plan in when you should revisit them. It's okay to say, we're gonna wait a quarter and then think about this again. All right, enough for me for now. Let's look at some real world examples. I'm gonna hand it off to Savannah, who's going to share how we've approached some of our largest and most ambitious projects at Reddit.
Thanks, Lori. So one of our largest projects in the last few years was modularizing our main app module, and that's what I'll be walking through today. There's a lot of great content out there around how to modularize code bases from a technical perspective, but what I'll focus on today is a different side to that work, which is how to justify the business case and how to bring your teams along to see the value in that work and contribute to it. So first off, why did we feel like this was worth tackling? Well, the platform team runs a developer survey every quarter, and a consistent theme we saw was the impact of long build times. We also saw this in our observability metrics and some benchmarking we had done. We knew from our own past efforts and various case studies that a modularized code base with a clean dependency graph was a great way to help reduce build times, so we were confident that investing in this was the right step forward for us. We had almost a third of our code living in our app module, and at the rate we were growing, we needed to make significant improvements just to keep our build times flat. But before tackling a large effort like this, we need to make sure we have the right tools in place to first stop the bleeding when it comes to adding code to our app module, and also avoid regressing on any progress we do make once we are able to pull code out into feature modules. We made changes to our CI pipeline that checked for a few things. For our main app and bottleneck modules, we blocked new file additions and additions over a line count threshold. This would not only fail the CI check, but it would also post a comment on the PR with reasoning and helpful wiki links on how to decouple code from our app module. But there were times where changes like this were unavoidable, so for those cases, we did allow exemptions. We automated this process so that if an approval from a code owner group was granted, then the PR would no longer be blocked. Once we had these mechanisms in place, we needed to audit the state of our app module. We wanted to create a clear picture of the scope of this work before we brought any asks to our feature teams or committed to any timelines. At the start of 2022, we found that more than 28% of our code lived in our app module, and this contained lots of feature code where dependencies were intertwined, so we didn't want to just jump in and start pulling code out. Instead, we wrote scripts to break down our app module dependencies by file and by package, sorted by lowest number of dependencies to highest. And from there, we identified some bottlenecks that were keeping various features coupled to app, and we took it upon ourselves as a platform team to untangle those so that things could be smoother for our feature teams once they were ready to tackle this work. As we modularized top-down, the more complex files slowly became less dependent on our app module, making them easier to pull out later on. We then found owners for each file and directory from our remaining script output, and we brought these asks to each of our feature teams with the justification that this work would be an investment in their team's productivity as well as an Android-wide effort. We also partnered with them to bake these asks into their roadmaps given our end-of-year goal and taking their product timelines into account. We knew modularization was primarily important for build times, but connecting it to other initiatives really helped both management and our feature teams see this as a worthwhile effort. So in addition to speeding up build times, modularization unlocked sample apps, which are essentially slices of our app that we use to compile and run individual features. And these live alongside our feature modules and require fewer dependencies, making them about 10 times faster than a typical app build. We also use this as an opportunity to evolve our modularization structure. Our previous approach became too complex, interconnected, and difficult to manage, and it was unclear where classes should live or how modules should depend on each other. So we replaced it with a simplified, more opinionated approach with enforcement in CI, making it easier for teams to find the right home for code once they were ready to pull it out of our app module. This also made code ownership more defined since teams often only owned code that was living in their feature modules and not their feature code that lived in our app module. There can be quite a bit of upfront cost when untangling dependencies before you'll see build time improvements, depending on the state of your dependency graph. So we wanted to highlight our progress along the way to show movement on our efforts. We provided context, documentation, and dedicated support channels for our developers, and then our subject experts monitored and contributed to these channels to quickly unblock engineers working on the effort. We then built dashboards around reductions in our app module and build times, which we shared during our Android-wide meetings. And this served as motivation and proof that lots of teams were working toward this effort, even if we were still early in realizing the build time benefits. All right, so we've made the case, we got the business on board, our developers are contributing to the effort. Now let's look at some results. On the left here is our monolith burn down, and on the right is our sample app adoption. And as you can see, our sample app usage has increased dramatically, and we've heard a lot of great feedback from our teams around how much more productive they are. So we're continuing to improve our tooling there and make them even easier to spin up. At this point, we've had over 70% of our modules adopt our simplified modularization structure, and our monolith is now 86% smaller than it was a year ago. Developer satisfaction has improved over the last year too, with build times being our #1 most improved area. We had several other projects last year that also helped to reduce build time, so I can't attribute these numbers solely to what I've talked about today, but it's worth highlighting that our local build times are down by about 45% compared to a year ago. We still have opportunities to bring our build times down, but our work around modularization and enforcing a cleaner dependency graph has laid the groundwork to make those possible. And now Steven's going to tell us a bit about how we adopted a new framework into our code base.
Hi, thanks, Savannah. We adopted Jetpack Compose, and we built our design system on top of it. That took a lot of coordination. Some of it we did pretty well. Other parts taught us lessons. I'm going to share what we learned from that. Let's talk about who's adopting your stuff. First, find those who will see immediate value from your project. These early adopters, usually teams that are fully resourced, are crucial partners. They test your idea, fix initial hiccups, and give support and examples for others. When you're looking around asking for these partners, don't get frustrated at rejection. Remember, it's not just about their approach to innovation. It's about their goals, their bandwidth, and their belief in your project's value. No team's going to adopt work-in-progress stuff unless they're expecting a benefit now. Also, don't get too attached to a particular team. Just because they were awesome early adopters on the last project doesn't mean they're available to be your guinea pigs for this one. While working with early adopters, make sure you're not only validating straightforward cases. Address complex use cases. You don't want all your complicated scenarios left to the late adopters or the mandated ones. All right, let's talk Compose. Today, we've got about 40% of our app using our design system, which is built on Compose. All new UI development uses Compose. It is a big ask to take a new framework like Compose and make it a foundational part of a large code base. We needed to validate this call, first to ourselves, is this the right call? And then to the rest of the business, here's why it's the right call. That might sound obvious, but it's pretty tempting to take shortcuts, especially if there's an engineering bubble that's really hyped about some new tech. We took a two-pronged approach, and it ended up working. The first part of the validation was an experiment. End of 2020, Compose was in its late alpha stages. Some of us were keeping an eye on it. We had a team outside of our org working on Reddit Talk, which was our live audio chat room feature. They were going for an MVP. It didn't need to be airtight from the beginning, so we capitalized on that. This was a team of early adopters. Their feature was a place where we could try out some new thing, relatively self-contained and unlikely to affect the rest of the app if it breaks. And it had enough complexity to give us some confidence that we weren't just testing an easy scenario. And being early adopters, they were willing to take on the random maintenance that comes with using less tested stuff. Reddit Talk was built in Compose and shipped while Compose was in beta. As far as the Android team was concerned, it went well. It gave us a head start on a few things should we decide to adopt Compose, like build tooling and a basic design library. But this is not enough to show that adopting Compose is the right move. Even if we were convinced, and truthfully some of us were, leadership across the company isn't going to buy it, and they shouldn't. A tech stack that works well for one use case might not work well for another. And they can't tell if roadblocks were caused by knowledge gaps that we can fix or flaws in the framework that we can't. That's where our second approach comes in. A categorical evaluation of Compose matched up against our other options. We scored them all based on a bunch of criteria we care about, like performance, tooling, accessibility. Written reasoning plus actual benchmarks and tests are easier to sell to engineering leadership than, trust me, it's good. This exercise actually dispelled some misunderstandings about all the options that we tried. And it helped a lot with getting the human bias out of the way. Full disclosure, I'm a fan of Compose. I have been since I tried it. I wanted Compose to win. Leadership isn't naive. They can tell when that's the case. If I say, yeah, it's worse at X, but I don't think that'll be a problem, they should be skeptical. After doing this evaluation, I could instead say, it's worse at X in these scenarios by this much. My recommendation is blank. That is a dramatically less nerve-wracking thing for leadership to hear. This whole evaluation is a document of statements just like that. Having it gave us a huge head start on arguing for adoption. When managers and directors are being told they need to adopt something new, having an informed document to point to makes that negotiation so much easier. To that point, one of the options you evaluate absolutely should be what you're currently using. You know it's annoying. This is a perfect time to document why. It'll help your argument. All this validation took a lot, but it got us to a place where Compose is the golden path, and the team is generally satisfied using it. I've got a cautionary tale to share. We were looking to validate some UI components and a new presentation architecture. We had an idea that we thought sounded like a winner. We could eat our own dog food by rebuilding a screen in the app, one kinda out of the way, but complicated enough to give us some confidence that our stuff works. We didn't own the feature in question, since we're a platform team, but we went ahead and reached out to the team that did. The strategy basically was, we do the work, design and implementation, they look it over, give it a thumbs up, and then we build and ship it.
Sorry, I can't.
Yes, you can. We thought it sounded reasonable. And maybe it would have been had we gone about it differently, but there were pitfalls. We mainly ran into trouble when it came time to ship. We had this weird co-parenting relationship of this screen with the team that actually owns it, and that led to it being kind of low priority on all of our radars. We would ramp up the feature flag, see crashes, try to prioritize them, while we still had tons more platform work on our plates, which is what our team really exists to do. It wasn't an org chart problem, or even really a tech problem. It was an ownership issue. That project did eventually ship, but it dragged on so long that some of the new stuff we used in it actually became deprecated as the migration went along. We shouldn't have taken on temporary ownership of something we weren't willing to fully own. So lesson learned. Work with other teams on your modernization. Don't do the work for them. Let's talk about knowledge sharing. We decided on Compose, and then we had to get a lot of Android engineers, most of whom hadn't tried Compose yet, up to speed on at least the basics. Easier said than done. People learn in very different ways. Some people like the blog post with code snippets format. We could have done that, but honestly, we're not gonna write better beginner tutorials than the ones already out there. We decided on something that we quite liked. We set up a knitting circle meeting with every Android engineer invited. In it, we had a volunteer newbie to Compose share their IDE screen and talk to a volunteer coach more experienced with Compose. We had a goal, and the newbie's job was to try and get to that goal with the coach's guidance. First goal was to build the UI of a Reddit post, and then we did some more fun stuff. We did this meeting a few times, rotating through newbies and coaches, exposing people to more and more Compose concepts along the way. While it wasn't super long-lived, we got a lot of feedback that it was very helpful. A few reasons why. First, since we picked the projects to do, we could dive into the Reddit-specific stuff, which is where online tutorials end. Second, and more importantly, most people are afraid to ask what they think are stupid questions. You gotta empathize with people that took this job, qualified with their current skill set, and now have to expand it to keep doing their job. This meeting was intentionally made super casual, and we reinforced that there are no stupid questions. The newbies were encouraged to ask them, and that paid off. With new frameworks, if someone's confused, it's pretty likely 10 more people are confused too. Just for another anecdote, our iOS team was also moving to a new UI framework at around the same time. They didn't do anything like this, and Android's adoption went markedly smoother. It had some downsides, mainly that it was hard to find a meeting time that worked for the whole Android team. We actually did 2 time slots for other time zones. And it took some work to prep the projects, but overall, definitely a net win. With the team feeling more confident, we got the ball rolling on Compose. I'm gonna hand it over to Catherine to talk about keeping up the pace on migrations once they're in progress.
Thank you, Steven. I'm here to talk about our Anvil migration at Reddit. And we're going to be using this migration to showcase our tactics for building and maintaining project momentum on these large-scale migrations while they're underway. When talking about migration momentum, there's 3 factors that are important for us to consider. There's the priority assigned to the project, the complexity of the work, and the size or overall time investment needed to complete it. Now, a lot of these factors are going to seem like they're set in stone and decided at the very beginning of the project, but we're going to use this segment to show how even when the migration is mid-flight, there's some things we can do to influence and tweak these parameters in different ways so that we can benefit in the form of positive migration momentum. how does the Anvil migration fit into these 3 different criteria? Answer is going to be that it's high in every possible category. First up, high in priority. Lots of important work here because of the prevalence of Dagger in our code base. To give you guys an idea of exactly how much is used, we have 309 modules using Dagger and 364 screens using legacy Dagger injection. That spans every single Android team we have at Reddit, feature and platform included. So this is important work that affects how everyone contributes to our Reddit Android codebase. It's also a hard one, high in complexity. Lots of what Steven just went through with the knowledge sharing segment for the Compose migration, we had to do the exact same with Anvil. Dagger in itself was confusing for quite a few people. So now when you add a brand new plugin on top of that with its own new syntax, we've got even more confusion to work with. And this migration is a long one, high in size. Every single one of the modules and screens we're talking about here needs at least 1 ticket associated to it to modernize the Dagger usage. Just thinking about how many Jira tickets that adds up to, if you end up wanting to do the math, it's pretty clear that this migration isn't a short one by any means. Now, with all that being said, this makes the Anvil migration a pretty great example for us to show how momentum can be maintained on these really large-scale migrations. Okay, so the first problem we're going to tackle when working on building momentum is maximizing priority. A lot of this is going to be decided early on in the project by how you sell your project or by your org's KPIs, but we can still continuously build up and remind people of the value and importance of the project along the way. The example we're going to use to demonstrate this concept is capitalizing on opportunities for giving shout-outs to the people who choose to work on these migrations, which, as we know, may not be the most glamorous task to choose from. To do so, you could be the person giving out formal acknowledgments, actively shouting out and recognizing people for finishing their migrations with awards, spot bonuses, or Slack channel messages. Could also be the person throwing out some quick, casual, positive comments on people's pull requests or in the guild meeting chat rooms when topics like these migrations come up. Stuff like a, "That's awesome," or "Thank you." You could also be the react that follows suit when any of your peers do any of the above. You do not need to be the loudest one in the room, but we can all do our part in helping build a culture where people understand this work is important and valued. All right, so that was our approach for upping the priority and value assigned to a project. Next problem factor we're going to tackle is lowering the complexity, because if the work is confusing, hard, and generally a complete pain to work on, probably engineers are not really going to want to do it. How can we make a really hard problem easier to work with? Our answer to this is to write scripts and plugins. This is where we really get to leverage and put our technical creativity to the test, sharing some things we wrote at Reddit. We have Python scripts for setting up new modules and screens for Anvil integration. This way, most of everything you need is there to begin with, and you just need to do some small tweaks to make sure Anvil works for your particular use case. We also have Android Studio plugins that can help do the very simple migrations for you. Now, these things are useful not only in the sense that they do the work for you, they're also helpful in showing developers what the modern standard looks like for our tech stack, or what the migration work should kind of look like. It's important to note that this is also the area that we're continuously working on improving, because as much as we would love it if we could write everything that everyone could possibly need at the very beginning of the migration, the reality of it is that this is a continuous cycle of feedback and response, with our developers voicing their biggest pain points on these migrations, and us working on removing them time after time again. So, always something new we can build in this area. The last tactic we're going to share is to keep things fun, and this is linked to the size problem in our migration momentum formula. When we have migrations that are big in size, they're going to take a while to complete. And with these efforts that are year-long or more on end, it becomes important for us to freshen it up a little bit every once in a while and keep people interested in the work. As an example of something we did at Reddit, we had our Snooze Week Anvil bashes. What this is, it's basically a bug bash, but for the Anvil migration. We held it every 2 quarters during our internal hackathon event called Snooze Week, and we opened it up for the entire Android community to participate in. The work is scoped out for you, you get to hang out with your other Android engineers, and everyone gets a super awesome 3D printed trophy, as shown on the right over here, as a token of our gratitude for joining our project. We've also noticed that this has been very effective in getting folks that never touched Anvil before started on the migration, because this essentially provides a time and space where people are all struggling together on the same thing. Questions can bounce off of each other, and we have available resources to provide answers on the ready. So overall, these Anvil bashes were really successful in helping boost participation, involvement, and excitement in our long Anvil migration. So that's all I wanted to share about our Anvil migration. I'm going to hand it back off to Lori to wrap us up and go over some of the key lessons we learned throughout these experiences.
Thanks, Catherine. Those Anvil trophies were a huge hit, so we'll definitely be doing more of that stuff. So we've talked about how you get projects greenlit, how you get them off the ground, how you maintain momentum. Let's talk a bit about some of the challenges we faced on many projects. One thing that's common about all of the experiences that Savannah and Steven and Catherine shared today is that eventually we sat down and fundamentally rethought how our app was architected. They didn't have all the answers, but they still got their projects off the ground. Too often, folks will swirl around about what needs to be done and how, without just imperfectly getting started. Or they make the mistake of thinking they're going to have some golden opportunity to completely rewrite their apps, and so they put off all their maintenance until it becomes a real problem. In practice, few people get those opportunities to rewrite and walk away from all their existing tech debt. They need strategies for maintenance. So by designing for flexibility from the start, you can often make your future migration efforts less painful and less costly. For example, by following solid design principles, at least you don't have to burn down your entire tech stack at once to fix something. You can be more surgical about refactoring and replace one responsibility at a time when you have sufficient abstractions. So on the platform team, we prioritize this in any architectural choice we're making because we want to be able to build upon it and we're going to know we're going to have to maintain it. So let's talk a little bit more about how we're taking a more holistic approach to tech debt. If you recall, I said this talk was for everyone, and this is why. Today's technology choices are always tomorrow's tech debt, and that's unavoidable. We are constantly iterating and experimenting, and all of this results in layers upon layers of tech choices, trade-offs, and ideas that were the best bets at the time. Sometimes it's strategic to take on this debt, but if you let it become unmanageable, like we did at one point with 2.5-hour build times, then you almost always are better off taking a holistic approach so that things don't get out of hand in the first place. In short, we take care not to let our technical choices compound more than necessary. So here are some of the things we do to keep our tech debt under control. I want to highlight 3 things from this list especially: variety, binges, and shelf lives. It is not enough to make superficial improvements and fix some bugs at your UI layer and call it like maintenance. The worst tech debt lives on areas of ownership boundaries and tech stack like layers. So these are going to require collaboration to fix. You're going to have to go learn to work with those other teams and build those relationships. Binge repayments. So by this I mean using hack weeks, and including our snooze week, for addressing your most important tech debt. This is almost always a sign that the organization doesn't have a real strategy for maintaining IP for the long term in certain areas. So when you see really important strategic work only showing up in your hackathons, make sure it gets ownership and moved onto someone's official roadmap, because that's where it belongs. Finally, assuming a shelf life of all decisions, especially your own. So this one is magical. If you just assume that every decision you're making will be stale in 2 to 3 years, this will actually help you maintain your abstractions and reduce your own bias around how lasting even your best ideas are. Another important set of concerns involves who is going to resolve this tech debt. It is important for those who incur the debt in the first place to be part of the solution. Feature factories and constant crunch times will lead to debt that is much harder to resolve later. This is where balls of mud and spaghetti code come from. It may require subject matter expertise to refactor well without really significant risk to the business. This is especially true in areas of low test coverage, poor documentation, insufficient abstraction. It will be risky to outsource or offshore resolving this sort of debt because it is almost always on your highest value surfaces, and it will require expertise to know how things work and do them right. So, like I said, unfortunately, most tech debt lives on your most high value surfaces, and the reason for this is that that's where you're focused on innovating. So, the reality is that when teams know they're going to have to revisit their choices later and their tech debt later, they tend to make better decisions up front. At the end of the day, feature owners know their features best, so they should be part of owning the care and maintenance of them most of the time. Finally, some tech debt will get to the point where it feels insurmountable. It is easy to become pessimistic when debt gets out of control. If it's never going to be done, then why even bother to start? There may even be engineers still around who wrote that code originally, and they might be a little sensitive to criticism about it. In times like these, it can be helpful to thank the engineers and the code base for getting you this far, and then just start improving somewhere. Remember that any challenge becomes trivial when you break it down into tiny little JIRA tickets, and focus on making steady progress and getting some incremental value. When speaking to skeptics, I have found it is actually very helpful to talk about how doing this work might change my answer to some of their requests. So for example, I might say to my PM, hey, you know how every time you ask me to do that particular project, I give you some crazy big estimate and say it's going to take forever? If you let us do this project over here, I might be able to say, maybe we can do that project, or yes. If I can turn my no into a yes, that's very compelling for my product and design partners. So, finally, please do not wait to celebrate. I get very frustrated when I find we are celebrating the finishing a project, and the people who kicked it off have long since left the team, maybe even the company. If you're doing it that way, you're doing it wrong. Celebrate small wins and teams that show grit and own their work for the longer term. Celebrate removing code and dependencies and risks to the business as much as adding them. All of this matters if you want your code base to remain flexible for future innovation, and these days that's an imperative. How you handle these challenges will look different from how we've done things at Reddit. The projects that are important to you should be specific to your business. However, to maintain an app over time, we will always have our eyes on some form of modernization opportunity. The approaches discussed today are widely applicable, and on our platform team, we reach for them time and time again. So with the pace of API SDK updates and upgrades, the evolving security and compliance landscape, this is all important to stay relevant. When the business or your boss wants to know when you'll finally be done with modernizing, you may always say, it depends. It depends on if we want to stay competitive or not. We hope the experiences and advice that Savannah, Steven, Catherine, and I have shared today about modernizing at Reddit are helpful, especially for your own pursuits as you try to build and maintain the best Android apps out there. The slides in this talk will be available online on our engineering blog in the next week or so, and please come up and say hi afterwards, and we'll take your questions.